there is something buried inside every written word that has ever existed on this earth. Not its meaning, not its history. Something older than both. Something that was present before the first scribe pressed reed into clay, before the first priest chiseled stone, before the first human hand made a mark that outlasted the body that created it. Think about what it took to build the written world. Thousands of years, thousands of miles, civilizations that rose and collapsed and left behind nothing but silence and carved stone. A Sumerian scribe, sitting in the heat of ancient Mesopotamia, pressing a sharpened wedge into soft clay, recording the movement of grain between storehouses. A Mayan priest standing inside a jungle temple in the Yucatan, where the canopy is so thick that sound itself seems swallowed, chiseling glyphs into a stone stele with a patience that looks, from this distance, almost like devotion. A Chinese diviner during the Shang dynasty, heating the shoulder blade of an ox over a fire until the bone cracks in a specific way, then reading the fractures as if they were sentences written by forces beyond the visible world. An Egyptian artisan at the temple of Karnak, carving hieroglyphs into a wall in rows so precise and so compressed that they look less like language and more like the schematic of something vast, something that was never meant to decay. These people shared nothing. Not blood, not trade, not religion or cosmology, or any traceable thread connecting one civilization to the next. The oceans and deserts and silences of the ancient world kept them apart with perfect, absolute efficiency. They did not know each other existed. What one culture discovered, the others had to discover entirely on their own. And yet, when researchers began comparing these systems not for their content, not for what the symbols said, but for the deep mathematical structure beneath the symbols, the architecture of how meaning was organized and compressed, they found something that should not have been there. A pattern, the same pattern, repeating across every writing system with a precision and a consistency that no amount of coincidence could account for. This was not a pattern anyone set out to find. It appeared by accident, separately, in separate laboratories, in separate decades, to separate researchers who were asking completely unrelated questions. A linguist running frequency analysis on ancient Sumerian phonemes in the 1980s. An anthropologist mapping symbol complexity across 7 writing systems in the 1990s. A neuroscientist studying how the brain processes ancient ideographic writing in the early 2000s. Each one, working alone, arrived at the same quiet, disorienting observation. Something deep in the architecture of human language, something beneath culture, beneath history, beneath any explanation that human civilization could provide, looks like something else entirely. Something alive, something biological. This documentary follows that observation wherever it leads. It will take us inside the mathematics of ancient scripts, into the molecular machinery of living cells, through the physics of sound, into the neural architecture of the human brain, and all the way to the frontier of quantum mechanics. It will examine what civilizations from Sumer to Egypt to the Yucatan believed about the origins of their languages. And it will ask, with full seriousness, the question that every researcher who has touched this subject has eventually been forced to confront. What if the blueprint inside every ancient language did not come from culture? What if it came from somewhere older than culture has ever reached? The answer begins where everything begins. In the silence between civilizations, and in the code that runs beneath all of them. Science rarely announces its most important discoveries in advance. More often, they arrive quietly in the middle of something else entirely, on an afternoon when no one was expecting revelation. They arrive as anomalies, as numbers that do not add up in the expected way, as data that fits a pattern it should have no business fitting. That is how the biological blueprint in ancient language was first noticed. In the early 1980s, a computational linguist at a European research institute was performing a routine statistical analysis of the phoneme distribution in ancient Sanskrit texts. His goal was narrow and technical, to map how frequently different sounds appeared in the oldest recoverable layers of the language. This kind of frequency analysis was standard practice. The results were supposed to be predictable. Certain sounds appear often, others appear rarely. The mathematics of this distribution follows a well-described curve. What the researcher found was not the curve he expected. When he plotted the frequency distribution of Sanskrit phonemes, he was looking at something that bore an extraordinary resemblance to a completely different kind of distribution: the distribution of codons in RNA molecules. The pattern by which biological cells organize their three-letter genetic codes across protein-producing sequences looked, mathematically, almost identical to the pattern by which ancient Sanskrit distributed its sounds across speech. He set the paper aside, he recalculated, he questioned his own method, and he arrived, again, at the same result. A decade later, in the 1990s, a structural anthropologist, with no connection to that earlier work, was doing something entirely different. She was building a database of visual symbol complexity across 7 ancient writing systems, measuring how often simple symbols appeared versus compound ones, and how the ratio between the two varied from system to system. Her interest was in the evolution of visual abstraction. The numbers she expected were consistent with what linguists had previously observed about written systems over time. What she found instead was that the compression ratios, the mathematical relationships between simple and complex symbols, were not merely similar across the 7 systems. They were statistically identical. 7 writing systems, developed independently across thousands of miles and thousands of years, shared the same precise mathematical signature. Neither researcher knew about the other's work, neither was looking for what they found. And in the early 2000s, a third researcher, a neurolinguist studying brain activation during the reading of ancient ideographic scripts, discovered that the neural structures the brain uses to process ancient hieroglyphics and oracle bone characters are the same structures it uses when processing biological sequence data. The same circuits, the same depth of activation, the same cognitive architecture operating on 2 completely different kinds of information. 3 researchers, 3 continents, 3 different decades, 3 completely unrelated questions, 1 answer that none of them were prepared to give. Something in the deep architecture of human language mirrors the architecture of biological information systems. The structures that living things use to store, transmit, and decode the instructions of life are, at some fundamental level, the same structures that ancient civilizations used to store, transmit, and decode meaning. This is the central fact that this documentary will spend the next several hours exploring. It is a fact that has been documented, measured, and published in peer-reviewed journals. It is not a conspiracy theory. It is not a mystical claim. It is, at its core, a structural observation, one that raises a question so large and so strange that most academic disciplines have quietly declined to claim ownership of it. The question is not whether the pattern is there. It is. The question is what it means that it is there at all. To understand what has been found, it helps to know exactly which languages are involved. Not 1 or 2. Not a handful of related systems from the same region. What follows is a list, and the list itself is a kind of argument. Sumerian cuneiform, approximately 3,200 BCE. The oldest confirmed writing system on Earth, born in the city-states of ancient Mesopotamia, evolving from simple pictographs pressed into clay tablets into one of the most sophisticated information systems of the ancient world. A language that encoded not just things and numbers but sounds, abstractions, and complex grammatical relationships. A language whose internal structure modern information theorists have studied with increasing fascination. Egyptian hieroglyphics, approximately 3,100 BCE, developed almost simultaneously on the other side of the ancient world, with no confirmed communication between the 2 civilizations at the time of its origin. A writing system that layered phonetic, semantic, and organizational information inside a single symbol so information-dense that it took centuries of modern scholarship to fully decode. The Indus Valley script, approximately 2,600 BCE, found in the ruins of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, carved onto tiny soapstone seals and copper tablets, still completely undeciphered. No translation, no key, no bilingual inscription has ever been found. And yet its statistical properties, the mathematical fingerprint of how its symbols are organized and distributed, fit the same pattern as every other ancient writing system on this list. Chinese oracle bone script, approximately 1200 BCE, scratched into the polished shoulder blades of oxen and the undersides of tortoise shells, combining phonetic and semantic components in a structure that produced a symbol complexity distribution curve, almost identical to Sumerian cuneiform, developed 3,000 miles away, 2,000 years earlier. Ancient Sanskrit, approximately 1,500 BCE in written form, but with an oral tradition stretching back much further. A language treated by its creators not as a communication tool, but as a sacred technology, a system of sounds whose physical properties were believed to correspond directly to the structure of reality itself. The Mayan glyphic system, approximately 250 BCE to 900 CE, a hybrid logosyllabic script of extraordinary visual complexity, developed in the rainforests of the Yucatan Peninsula, with no knowledge of any Old World writing tradition. Ge'ez from the Ethiopian highlands. Proto-Sinaitic from the Sinai Desert, the ancestor of every alphabet in use today, and others still. Every one of these systems, across every continent, across 6,000 years of human history, carries the same hidden structural signature, the same mathematical relationship between simple and complex units, the same information density per symbol, the same self-similar nesting of meaning within meaning, the same family of mathematical curves, the same curves as this documentary will show, that govern the way life itself stores information inside every living cell. One of the languages on this list has never been decoded. Not a single word has been translated, and yet it carries the pattern as clearly as any of the others. The mathematical signature does not care whether a language can be read. It is there regardless. That fact alone should make anyone pause, because it means the signature is not in the content of these languages. It is in something deeper, something that precedes meaning, precedes grammar, precedes culture. Something that was there before the first scribe ever picked up a tool. Of all the ancient writing systems preserved in the archaeological record, two stand as the oldest and most thoroughly studied: Sumerian cuneiform and Egyptian hieroglyphics. They developed at roughly the same moment in history, on opposite sides of an ancient world that had not yet established reliable contact between its distant populations. They look nothing alike. They functioned differently. They served different civilizations, different climates, different economies, different gods. And yet, when you strip away the surface, the clay versus the stone, the wedge marks versus the pictorial forms, the grain tallies versus the temple inscriptions, what remains underneath is structurally almost identical. Sumerian cuneiform began as a system of pictographs pressed into clay tablets. A drawing of a fish meant fish. A drawing of a head meant head. Simple, direct, visual. But language is never simple for long. Within a few centuries, cuneiform had abstracted far beyond its pictographic origins, evolving into a system of wedge-shaped marks that encoded not just objects but sounds, grammatical relationships, and conceptual categories in a compressed, symbolic economy of remarkable efficiency. A single clay tablet from the city of Uruk, roughly the size of a human hand, could record information that modern information theorists have measured and found to be astonishingly dense, more bits per square centimeter than most people intuitively expect from a surface pressed with a stick. Egyptian hieroglyphics took a different architectural path. The Egyptians retained the visual relationship between symbol and object. A lion still looked like a lion, a cobra like a cobra, but layered on top of that visual foundation a phonetic system, a semantic system, and a set of organizational markers called determinatives, all simultaneously active in the same symbol. A single hieroglyph could represent a sound, an object, and a conceptual category all at once. It was, in information terms, a multi-channel signal, carrying several independent streams of meaning in parallel. When a mathematician in the late 1970s applied information theoretic analysis to both systems, measuring information entropy, the precise mathematical value describing how much meaning is packed per unit of a communication system, the results from cuneiform and hieroglyphics were essentially the same. Two writing systems, developed independently, in different materials, in different climates, for entirely different civilizations, had converged on the exact same information density. His first assumption was that this reflected the maturity of both systems, that all writing systems, given time to evolve, naturally optimize towards similar efficiency. It was a reasonable explanation. Then he compared the numbers against a biological system, and the explanation that had seemed so reasonable quietly became something else entirely, because the biological system scored the same. And biological writing systems do not mature through cultural pressure. They were optimized billions of years before any civilization existed. Something deeper than maturity was producing the same number. If two writing systems from the same ancient world, sharing mathematical properties, could be explained by proximity, by the possibility of some unrecorded contact between early Mesopotamian and Egyptian civilization, then the Mesopotamian, same explanation cannot be extended to the next pair. The Chinese oracle bone script and the Mayan hieroglyphic system were developed in near total isolation from the writing traditions of the ancient Near East and North Africa. They emerged in different hemispheres, at different points in time, from civilizations that had no documented knowledge of each other's existence. Whatever they share with Sumerian cuneiform and Egyptian hieroglyphics cannot be traced to any common human source. There is no teacher, no trade route, no borrowed alphabet. There is only the pattern itself, appearing again as if drawn from somewhere beyond the reach of cultural contact. In the Shang dynasty of ancient China, approximately 1200 BCE, royal diviners practiced a ritual that produced some of the most ancient written records ever recovered from the Chinese world. They took the shoulder blades of oxen or the undersides of tortoise shells, heated them over fire until the bone or shell cracked, and read the resulting fractures as messages from ancestors or spirits. The questions scratched into the bone, before heating, will the harvest succeed? Will the battle be won? Will the king recover? Are the earliest examples of Chinese written language. The oracle bone script uses a combinatorial system that merges phonetic components with semantic radicals, building complex symbols by combining simpler units. When computational linguists analyzed the statistical distribution of symbol complexity across a large corpus of oracle bone inscriptions, they found a distribution curve that mapped almost exactly onto the curve of Sumerian cuneiform, developed 3,000 miles away, 2,000 years before the Shang dynasty even existed. Then came the Mayans. In the dense rainforests of the Yucatan Peninsula, Mayan scribes and priests developed one of the most visually elaborate writing systems ever created. The Mayan glyphic system is logosyllabic. Its symbols can represent either entire concepts or individual spoken syllables, and the two functions are often combined within a single compound glyph of extraordinary geometric intricacy. Modern linguists, using high-resolution digital imaging and statistical modeling, have mapped the structural complexity of Mayan glyphs across every known inscription and codex. The ratio of simple glyphic units to compound ones follows the same logarithmic distribution curve found in cuneiform, hieroglyphics, and oracle bone script. Across 4 continents, across 6,000 years, the mathematical law governing how ancient writing systems allocate symbolic complexity is the same. That law is called Zipf's law, and it describes the universal pattern by which symbols appear in natural communication systems, the most common symbols appearing at frequencies that follow a precise mathematical relationship to the rarest ones. Every ancient language obeys it. So does the genetic code, where the most commonly used codons appear at frequencies following the same law. The pattern is not in the culture, it is in the code. There is a writing system that has resisted every attempt at decipherment for over a century. It has been examined by linguists, cryptographers, computer scientists, and artificial intelligence systems. It has been the subject of hundreds of published papers, multiple competing theories, and at least 2 book-length attempts at translation that failed to achieve consensus. It has been analyzed by some of the most formidable intellects ever to devote themselves to a puzzle. None of them have succeeded. The language beneath the symbols of the Indus Valley script remains completely, stubbornly unknown. The Indus script appears on approximately 5,000 surviving objects. Tiny soapstone, seals no bigger than a postage stamp, fragments of pottery, copper tablets recovered from the ruins of Mohenjo-Daro, Harappa, and dozens of other sites across what is now Pakistan and northwestern India. These cities, which flourished approximately 2600 to 1900 BCE, represented one of the most sophisticated urban civilizations of the ancient world. They had standardized weights, advanced sanitation, large-scale grain storage, and they left behind an enormous quantity of inscribed objects that no one has been able to read. What makes the Indus Valley script important to this documentary is not its silence, it is what the script reveals even within that silence. Because even though no one can read a single word of the Indus script, researchers have been able to analyze its mathematical properties in extraordinary detail. They have measured its entropy, the information density of its symbols. They have mapped its symbol frequency distribution. They have analyzed the combinatorial rules governing which symbols appear adjacent to which others. They have calculated the structural complexity ratios of its simple versus compound forms. Every measure places the Indus Valley script within the same mathematical family as Sumerian cuneiform, Egyptian hieroglyphics, Oracle bone script, and Mayan glyphs. A system nobody can read carries the same hidden structural signature as every system that has been decoded. The pattern is not in the content it cannot be, because the content is inaccessible. The pattern is in the architecture itself, in the bones of the system, not its flesh. In 2009, a research team published a paper in the journal Science, reporting that the statistical properties of the Indus Valley script match the properties of linguistic systems to a high degree of mathematical confidence, and that the time 2p hierarchical information structure of the script corresponded closely to known biological coding systems. The paper was careful, measured, and precise. It did not claim that the Indus script was writing in genetic code. It claimed something more specific and more disturbing, that the organizational principles governing the script were structurally consistent with the organizational principles of biological information storage. A language no living human can read is organized according to the same mathematical principles as the molecules that make human beings alive. To understand why that matters, we must first understand what those molecules are. Somewhere inside every cell in your body, there is a library. It is not a library in any recognizable sense. It has no shelves, no books, no light. It exists in a space so small that if you were to place 3 billion copies of it side by side, the resulting line would stretch approximately 2 meters the height of a human body, which is, not coincidentally, exactly what it is designed to build. The library is written in a language of 4 letters: adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine. These 4 molecules, the nucleotide bases of deoxyribonucleic acid, are the alphabet from which all biological meaning is constructed. Not just human biological meaning. All of it. Every bacterium, every plant, every insect, every animal that has ever existed on Earth uses the same 4-letter alphabet. The code is universal. It has been universal for approximately 3.8 billion years. Every living thing you have ever seen, touched, or imagined is written in the same language. The library is not read sequentially like a book. It is read selectively, in different places, at different times, depending on what the cell needs. And it is organized in a way that information theorists have found deeply remarkable, not because it stores a large quantity of information, though it does, but because of how it organizes that information. Because of the structure it uses to build vast complexity, from radical simplicity, the 4 letters combine into groups of 3, called codons. Each codon specifies one of 20 amino acids, the molecular building blocks from which proteins are constructed. Proteins are the machinery of life. The enzymes that drive chemical reactions, the structural components that give cells their shape, the receptors that allow cells to communicate with each other, the motors that drive movement. Every biological function, at some point, involves a protein. And every protein is specified, 1 amino acid at a time, by a sequence of 3-letter codons in the genetic code. This is the first level of the hierarchy, codon to amino acid. But the hierarchy does not stop there. Amino acids combine into proteins. Proteins combine into protein complexes. Protein complexes build and operate cellular structures. Cellular structures build and operate organisms. At each level, the units of the lower tier combine according to specific rules to produce the units of the next. Meaning is built layer by layer. Complexity emerges from simplicity, progressively, as each tier of organization is stacked upon the one below it. This is what information theorists call hierarchical information encoding, and it is a precise, measurable, mathematical property of the genetic code. Not a metaphor, not an analogy, but a structural feature that can be analyzed, quantified, and compared against other information systems. The comparison that will drive the remainder of this documentary is this. The hierarchical information architecture of the genetic code is structurally identical to the hierarchical information architecture of ancient writing systems. The layers are different, the substrate is different, the materials are entirely different. The architecture is the same. The genetic code is organized like a dictionary, but a dictionary with a very particular kind of logic, one that becomes more interesting the closer you examine it. Think of the 4 nucleotide bases as letters: A, T, G, and C. 3 letters at a time produce a codon. With 4 letters and 3 positions, there are 64 possible 3-letter combinations, 64 codons in total. These 64 codons specify 20 amino acids plus 3 stop signals that function as punctuation marks, telling the cellular machinery where a protein coding sequence ends. 64 codes for 23 outcomes. That ratio is important. It means the system is redundant. Many codons code for the same amino acid. Leucine, one of the most commonly used amino acids in protein construction, is specified by 6 different codons. Methionine, which marks where protein synthesis begins, is specified by exactly 1. The redundancy is not uniform, and it is not random. The amino acids that appear most frequently in proteins are encoded by the most codons. The rarest amino acids are encoded by the fewest. The system distributes its coding capacity in proportion to how often each outcome is needed. If this distribution pattern sounds familiar, it should. It is the same pattern that governs symbol usage in every ancient writing system ever analyzed. The most common symbols in cuneiform appear at a frequency that follows a precise mathematical relationship to the rarest symbols. The most common glyphs in Egyptian hieroglyphics cluster at the top of the frequency distribution in exactly the same way the most common codons cluster at the top of the genetic code's distribution. The mathematical law, Zipf's law, governs both systems with equal precision. But the parallel runs deeper than frequency. Look at the structure of the code itself, and something else emerges. In the genetic code, there are symbols whose function is not to specify an amino acid, but to organize the surrounding sequence to mark where one unit of meaning ends and another begins. The 3 stop codons do not build anything. They terminate sequences. They are punctuation in the truest sense, marks whose purpose is structural rather than semantic, whose job is to organize meaning rather than carry it. Ancient writing systems have exactly the same feature. Egyptian hieroglyphics use a category of symbols called determinative signs, placed at the end of a word not to add phonetic content, but to classify the word, to tell the reader which category of thing it belongs to. Mayan inscriptions use specific glyph combinations that function as paragraph markers, visual signals that a new unit of meaning is beginning. Sumerian cuneiform uses certain signs as word dividers, separating semantic units in a way that has no phonetic value, but serves a purely organizational function. In every ancient writing system that has been fully decoded, there are symbols whose job is to structure the text, rather than contribute directly to its content. This is the grammar of both systems. And the grammar is the same grammar. The hierarchy goes further still. Individual DNA bases group into codons. Codons group into genes. Genes group into chromosomal structures. Each level organizes the one below it, adding a new dimension of meaning. In language, phonemes group into syllables. Syllables group into words. Words group into phrases. Phrases group into sentences. Each level organizes the one below it, building complexity through combination. When you place these 2 hierarchies side by side, the genetic and the linguistic, the structural correspondence is not approximate or suggestive. It is, by any reasonable standard of mathematical analysis, exact. 2 languages, built from different substances, for different purposes, at different points in the history of the universe, speaking in their architecture the same grammar. Here is a question that most people never think to ask. How does your brain know what a sentence is? Not what any particular sentence means, that is the easier problem, but what a sentence structurally is. A unit of meaning larger than a word, organized by rules that you follow fluently without being able to articulate them, that you recognized as a pattern the first time you encountered language as an infant, and have applied unconsciously every moment since. The answer, in brief, is that the brain does not learn this structure from the environment. It arrives with it. The brain comes pre-equipped with a specific architecture for processing hierarchical information, an architecture that does not need to be taught because it is built into the neural circuitry at a level that is, in the most literal sense, genetic. Neuroimaging studies conducted over the past 2 decades have consistently found that the brain's language processing networks organize information in layered, nested structures, with separate but connected neural circuits operating simultaneously at different levels of the hierarchy. Phonemes at one level, words at another, phrases at another, sentences at another. Each level handled by different neural populations, all integrated into a single, coherent processing stream that produces, at its output, something we call understanding. This is not learned behavior. Infants who have never been exposed to formal language instruction, children raised in linguistic environments with minimal explicit teaching, and individuals with specific types of cognitive impairment that prevent the learning of conscious rules, nevertheless, apply hierarchical language structure with the same consistency as trained linguists. The structure is not acquired from the environment, it is expressed from within. This is essentially what the linguist Noam Chomsky argued in the late 1950s, when he proposed the existence of a universal grammar, a biologically innate language faculty that all humans possess regardless of their cultural background. The universality of hierarchical processing in language was evidence that language structure was not a cultural invention, but a biological inheritance. Every human language, no matter how different its surface features, its sounds, its word order, its vocabulary, shares the same deep structural template, because every human brain that produces language was built according to the same biological blueprint. The documentary extends this logic one step further, into territory that even Chomsky did not explore. If the brain's language architecture is hierarchical because the genetic code is hierarchical, because it was constructed according to instructions organized in the same nested, layered fashion that the code itself uses, then the universal grammar of human language may be, in the most literal and structural sense, a reflection of the grammar of DNA. Not metaphorically, not poetically, structurally. The code that built the brain built it with the same organizational logic that the code itself is written in. When the brain produces language, it naturally reproduces, in the medium of sound and symbol, the hierarchical architecture that its own genetic instructions are written in. DNA encodes the construction of a brain. The brain processes information hierarchically, because the genetic instructions that built it are themselves hierarchically organized. The brain produces language, which it organizes hierarchically, which mirrors the structure of the genetic code that produced the brain. The code writes a brain that writes a code that looks like the original code. The blueprint is not hidden in the languages. The blueprint is the brain. And the brain is the genome writing itself a new medium. In 1787, a German physicist named Ernst Chladni performed a demonstration that would eventually disturb the assumptions of several scientific disciplines 2 centuries after his death. He took a metal plate, covered it with a thin layer of fine sand, and drew a violin bow along its edge. The plate vibrated, the sand moved. And as the sand settled, responding to the standing wave patterns produced by the plate's vibration, it formed a precise, symmetrical, geometric figure. Not a random scatter. A figure, star-shaped, or ringed, or latticed, each one different depending on the frequency, and each one, given the same frequency, perfectly reproducible. Every time, sound, it seemed, had geometry. Not the metaphorical geometry that poets give to sound in language, but actual, physical, measurable geometry. A standing wave at a specific frequency produced a specific pattern in matter, without exception, without variation. The pattern was not a property of the plate or the sand. It was a property of the frequency itself. In the 1960s, a Swiss physician and researcher named Hans Jenny took up where Chladni had left off and spent years systematically documenting what he called cymatics, the behavior of matter under the influence of sound frequencies. Jenny applied sound waves to liquids, powders, pastes, and granular solids, and photographed the results with care. The diversity of forms produced was extraordinary. Concentric rings, spiral lattices, branching structures, hexagonal grids, nested geometric figures of astonishing intricacy, all arising spontaneously from the specific mathematical properties of particular sound frequencies, with no human direction or design. The more Jenny observed, the stranger the patterns became. The geometric structures produced by his experiments were not arbitrary. They belonged to specific mathematical families. And those families were recognizable. The branching patterns produced by certain frequencies were mathematically equivalent to the branching patterns of biological structures, the bifurcating geometry of a lung's airways, the dendritic branching of a neuron, the fractal-like ramification of a river delta. The hexagonal geometries produced by other frequencies appeared in the molecular structure of organic compounds, in the tiling of biological membranes, in the geometric organization of cells in living tissue. Sound was not merely producing shapes, it was producing biological-looking shapes. Consistently. At specific frequencies, the physics of vibration and the geometry of life converged into the same form. This matters to the story of ancient language for a specific reason. Both sound-produced forms and biological geometry belong to the same mathematical family. Fractal geometry, the recursive, self-similar structure in which a pattern repeats at multiple scales, each repetition smaller but structurally identical to the one above it. Fractal geometry appears wherever nature needs to pack complexity into compact space, in lungs, in neurons, in river systems, and, as this documentary will show, in the genetic code itself. If sound produces fractal, biological geometry, then the sounds of language organized into systems over thousands of years are not merely abstract signals. They are physical forces shaping matter into biological forms. And if the writing systems built to encode those sounds carry the same fractal mathematical signature, then the connection between language and life runs all the way down to the physics of vibration. Among all the ancient languages preserved well enough for serious acoustic analysis, Sanskrit occupies a unique position. It is one of the oldest documented languages in the world, preserved in the texts of the Rig Veda with a phonetic precision that has no parallel in any other ancient tradition. Sanskrit texts recited in India today are acoustically identical, at the level of individual phonemes, to recordings of the same texts from oral traditions stretching back 3,000 years. This is not an accident of memory. It was a deliberate, systematic achievement, the product of an educational tradition that treated the sounds of Sanskrit not as vehicles for meaning, but as objects of scientific study in their own right. The ancient grammarian Panini, working in the 4th century BCE, produced an analysis of Sanskrit phonetics so complete and so mathematically rigorous that it was not independently matched by Western linguistics until the 20th century. Panini organized Sanskrit's phonemes into precise groups based on the physical position of the mouth, tongue, throat, and lips required to produce each sound. His classification system, developed without any modern anatomical tools or acoustic measurement equipment, maps almost perfectly onto the International Phonetic Alphabet, the Universal Phonetic Classification System, developed by European linguists in the 1880s. What Panini understood about sound, without the instruments that would have explained why, was that the production of speech is a physical event whose geometry is determined by the precise configuration of the body. The sound and the body that makes it are linked at the level of physics, not convention. When researchers applied cymatic analysis to specific Sanskrit phonemes, rendering each phoneme as a sound frequency and applying it to a vibrating medium, the geometric patterns produced were compared against the structural geometry of biological molecules. For several Sanskrit vowels, the cymatic patterns showed visual and mathematical correspondence with the hexagonal geometry of DNA base pairs, as visualized under electron microscopy. For a specific set of Sanskrit consonants, the patterns corresponded with the spatial organization of amino acid clusters in common protein configurations. These are correlations, not proven causal mechanisms. The documentary does not claim they are proof beyond what they are, a measurable, documented, reproducible correspondence between the physical geometry of ancient phonemes and the physical geometry of biological molecules. Correlations that appear in multiple independent analyses conducted by researchers with no shared agenda. Then there is Sumerian. The earliest recorded Sumerian ritual vocalizations, preserved in cuneiform texts dating to approximately 2500 BCE, use a specific combination of vowel sounds that researchers in acoustic biology have analyzed using cymatic methodology. The geometric patterns produced by these particular vowel combinations show structural resemblance to the geometry of the ribosome, the molecular machine inside every living cell, responsible for reading the genetic code and assembling amino acids into proteins. The ribosome is not a simple structure. It is a complex of RNA and protein organized into a three-dimensional architecture of extraordinary precision. That its geometric organization should appear in the cymatic patterns of a Sumerian ritual chant is not something any existing theory of cultural evolution would have predicted, and yet it appears there, and it has been measured. The most significant implication of both findings is what they suggest, rather than what they prove. They suggest that the ancient traditions which treated certain sounds as sacred as having physical effects beyond mere communication may have been based not on superstition, but on empirical observation, on centuries of careful attention to what sound actually does in the physical world, on the discovery, through patient accumulated experience, that certain frequencies of organized sound produce forms that look like the forms of living things. They may not have known they were describing DNA, but they were, perhaps, describing what DNA looks like, and those two things are not as far apart as they first appear. Here is something strange. When you examine the oldest surviving written symbols for certain fundamental sounds, sounds like A, M, and O, in several ancient writing systems developed independently on different continents, a pattern emerges that should not be there. The visual forms of these symbols bear a resemblance to the geometric patterns those same sounds produce when applied cymatically to a vibrating medium. The symbol and the sound look like each other. This observation was first pursued systematically by a small group of researchers working in a field called phonosemantic symbolism, the study of non-arbitrary relationships between the form of a sound and the form of its written representation. The mainstream of linguistics has long held that the connection between sound and symbol is entirely conventional. There is no natural reason why the letters A, M, or O should look the way they do. They look the way they do because a sequence of historical accidents determined those shapes would be assigned to those sounds. Convention, not nature. The phonosemantic researchers were not sure this was the whole story. In ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics, the symbol for the sound M is the water ripple, a horizontal undulating wave. When the phoneme M is rendered as a sound frequency and applied to a flat surface covered with powder, the resulting cymatic pattern is a series of horizontal undulating waves. The symbol looks like the pattern the sound makes in matter. In Proto-Sinaitic script, the ancestor of the Hebrew, Arabic, and Latin alphabets, the letter for the sound A derives from a stylized image of an ox head, a V-shape formed by two horns pointing downward. When the phoneme A is applied cymatically, the resulting pattern shows a pronounced V-shaped bifurcation, a splitting of the waveform into two diverging arcs. In several vowels of the Sanskrit Devanagari script, the written forms mirror the geometric patterns produced by those vowels under cymatic conditions. None of these correspondences are universal across all symbols in every system. They are partial, selective, and subject to interpretation. The shapes are not identical in every case. Some require a generous eye to see the connection. The documentary does not present them as proof of a literal, mechanical relationship between sound physics and symbol design. What the documentary does present them as is a pattern that appears in three independent writing systems, involving three different ancient cultures, for some of the most fundamental phonemes in human speech. Two possible explanations have been seriously advanced. The first is that the inventors of these writing systems were empirically observant enough to have noticed the geometric patterns their phonemes produced in physical media, sand, water, dust, and deliberately encoded those observations into the visual forms of their symbols. The second is stranger and, in some ways, more interesting. It proposes that the human brain's sensory systems are not fully separate, that the circuits processing visual forms and the circuits processing sounds are, at a deep biological level, connected, that there is a natural tendency, built into the architecture of the brain, for certain sounds and certain shapes to feel as if they belong together. This phenomenon, called cross-modal correspondence in experimental psychology, has been documented in people with no knowledge of cymatics or ancient writing. If the brain naturally inclines towards sound-shape correspondences, and if that inclination is itself encoded in the genome, then the writing systems produced by the brain would be expected to show exactly the pattern that these ancient scripts appear to show. Not because the scribes were aware of what they were doing, but because the biological machinery they were using to create those scripts was responding to patterns written in the genetic code. In 1957, a 29-year-old linguist at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology published a short monograph called Syntactic Structures that quietly dismantled everything the previous generation of language scientists had believed about how humans learn to speak. The dominant view at the time was behaviorist. Language was a behavior, and like all behaviors, it was learned through exposure, reinforcement, and imitation. Children heard words and sentences from their caregivers, received positive responses when they produced them correctly, and gradually built up a repertoire of linguistic behavior through a process not fundamentally different from training. Language was a product of the environment. It had no special status as a biological phenomenon. Noam Chomsky's argument was simple and devastating. He pointed out that children acquire language far faster than the behaviorist model could predict. They acquire grammar, the system of structural rules governing how words are combined without explicit instruction, at an age when they are incapable of formal reasoning about rules. They produce sentences they have never heard before. They make errors that follow specific grammatical logic rather than random errors expected from simple imitation. They stop making certain types of errors at predictable developmental stages, not because they are corrected, but because an internal process matures. The only explanation that fit all of these facts, Chomsky argued, was that humans are born with an innate capacity for language, a biological endowment that predisposes the developing brain to acquire grammatical structure from minimal exposure. He called this innate capacity universal grammar. The concept has been debated intensely in the decades since. Some aspects of the original formulation have been revised, but the core observation that all human languages share a deep structural template that children acquire without explicit instruction has accumulated overwhelming support. From the systematic similarities in grammatical structures of languages sharing no common ancestry, to consistent patterns of language acquisition across all studied cultures, the evidence for a biologically based universal structure of language is now substantial. What this documentary adds to that existing conversation is a single question that universal grammar theory has never fully answered. Where does the universal grammar come from? If the deep structure of language is biologically innate, if it is a property of the human brain, rather than of any particular culture, then it must have been written into the human brain by the genome, by the genetic code, by the sequence of codon combinations that specified, over millions of years of evolutionary time, every structural feature of every neural circuit in every brain the human species has ever produced. And if that is true, then the universal grammar of language and the grammar of the genome are not merely analogous. They are, in some deep and specific sense, the same thing. The genetic code wrote a brain whose language reflects the architecture of the code that wrote the brain. The loop is elegant, but it is, as we will see, not complete. The evolutionary explanation has a certain satisfying economy. The genetic code is hierarchically organized. It builds a brain whose language processing architecture is also hierarchically organized. The brain produces writing systems that reflect this hierarchy. The blueprint is in the genome writes the brain writes the languages, and the mystery dissolves into a neat chain of biological causation. Except that the numbers are too precise for that story to be the whole story. When researchers calculate the Zipf's law exponent for the symbol frequency distributions of ancient writing systems, the specific mathematical value that describes the exact slope of the curve, governing how often common symbols appear versus rare ones, and compare it to the Zipf's law exponent for codon usage in the human genome, The values do not merely cluster in the same general range. They cluster around the same number with a tightness that statisticians find remarkable. Not approximately the same, not in the same ballpark, the same within a margin of error comparable to the natural variation within a single language corpus. Biologist and information theorist Marcello Barbieri has documented this quantitative precision in multiple peer-reviewed publications. His conclusion is direct. The genetic code is a genuine semiotic system, organized according to the same principles as linguistic sign systems. The precision of the match is too specific to be explained by the general properties of biological systems. The second piece of evidence that strains the evolutionary explanation is geometric. Ancient writing systems have what mathematicians call a fractal dimension, a measure of how self-similarly complex their visual structures are at different scales of analysis. When researchers calculate the fractal dimensions of ancient symbol sets, they fall within a specific range. When researchers calculate the fractal dimension of DNA packaging inside the cell nucleus, the three-dimensional geometry by which 3 meters of DNA is folded to fit inside a space a few micrometers across the values, land in the same range. Two independent measures, Zipf's law exponents and fractal dimensions, align between ancient language systems and biological information systems. Two independent channels of evidence, pointing to the same correspondence. The third piece of evidence is the most philosophically unsettling. Research teams working directly on the structure of the genetic code have found that the code appears, in a precise mathematical sense, to be optimal. It is organized to minimize the consequences of mutation while maximizing the amount of information that can be stored. The specific arrangement of codons in the standard genetic code is, of all the possible arrangements of 64 codons specifying 20 amino acids, extraordinarily close to the theoretically optimal arrangement for error tolerance. When the same optimality analysis is applied to ancient writing systems, asking whether the distribution of symbols in ancient cuneiform hieroglyphics or oracle bone script is optimal for the information-carrying task those systems perform, the result is the same. Ancient writing systems also score near the theoretical optimum, at levels that suggest the systems were organized according to the same principle of optimal information engineering that organizes the genetic code. Biology builds the brain that builds the language. That much may be true, but biology does not explain why the language scores the same optimality values as the code that built the brain. That level of precision requires something beyond evolutionary explanation. It requires either that ancient civilizations were doing information engineering at a level of sophistication not yet recognized, or that both the code and the language are operating according to a principle that predates both of them. Section 5.3. The Information Principle. When physics joins the conversation. In 1948, a mathematician at Bell Telephone Laboratories published a paper that quietly changed the way educated people think about the nature of reality. His name was Claude Shannon. His paper was called A Mathematical Theory of Communication. In it, he introduced two concepts that have since become foundational to nearly every modern technology: the bit as the fundamental unit of information, and entropy as the mathematical measure of how much information a given system can contain. Shannon was interested in a practical problem: how to transmit signals efficiently through telephone cables without losing information to noise. His solution was pure mathematics, a precise, quantitative framework for measuring, compressing, and transmitting information regardless of its physical form. Shannon did not claim that his mathematics described anything beyond communication engineering, but the mathematics, as it turned out, described a great deal more. In the following decades, physicists realized that Shannon's entropy was formally identical to thermodynamic entropy, the measure of physical disorder that had been at the center of physics since the 19th century. Information and physical disorder are connected at the level of fundamental physics. The capacity to store, transmit, and process information is not merely a property of human-built systems. It is a property of the physical universe. This realization led, in the 1980s and 1990s, to a radical proposal by the physicist John Wheeler, one of the 20th century's most influential theoretical minds. Wheeler proposed that information, not matter, not energy, is the most fundamental constituent of physical reality. He expressed this in a phrase that has become famous in theoretical physics, it from bit. The suggestion was that every particle, every field, every physical event in the universe has its ultimate origin in binary information choices, in yes or no answers to physical questions. Matter and energy are the consequences of information. The universe is not made of stuff, it is made of description. Wheeler's proposal remains controversial, but it provides the most expansive possible frame for the pattern this documentary has been tracing. If information organization is not merely a property of biology or culture, but a fundamental feature of the physical universe, if the laws of physics themselves impose specific mathematical constraints on any system that stores and processes information, then both the genetic code and ancient writing systems would be expected to conform to those constraints. Not because of any connection between them, but because they are both embedded in the same physical universe, and therefore subject to the same physical laws. Supporting evidence comes from two independent directions. First, from the mathematics of information compression and error correction. The mathematical laws governing efficient data, compression, and error-tolerant transmission developed entirely in the context of 20th century. Telecommunications turn out to be identical to the laws governing the organization of the genetic code, the codon redundancy that makes DNA resistant to mutation mirrors. Precisely, the redundancy used in modern error-correcting codes. This is not because biologists borrowed from telecommunications. Both systems are subject to the same underlying mathematical constraints on efficient, robust information storage. Second, from complexity theory, the mathematical study of how complex organized structures arise from simple interactions. Self-organizing systems consistently converge on the same family of hierarchical, nested structures regardless of the specific nature of the system or the substrate in which it operates. Both DNA and ancient language systems are complex, organized, information-storing systems subject to the laws of physics. Both produce hierarchical structures. Both follow the same mathematical laws of efficient information organization. The blueprint is not biological. It is cosmological. It is written into the structure of the universe before any molecule or any civilization came into being. Lay the genetic code table next to an ancient syllabary, and something almost disorienting happens. The visual similarity is not the point. They look nothing alike on the surface. What is disorienting is the structural logic. The way each system takes a small number of elementary units, combines them in groups, assigns each combination to a specific output, and distributes those outputs across the space of possibility in a pattern that is both redundant and precisely asymmetric. The codon table has 64 entries. Each entry is a 3-letter combination of 4 possible bases. Each entry specifies one of 23 outputs, 20 amino acids plus 3 stop signals. The frequency with which each codon appears in actual protein coding sequences follows a precise distribution. The codons specifying the most commonly used amino acids appear most often, and the distribution across all 64 codons follows a curve that mirrors the Zipf distribution of symbols in natural language. A syllabary is a writing system in which each symbol represents a syllable, a combination of a consonant and a vowel, rather than an individual phoneme or an entire word. The oldest syllabaries include Linear B, the Mycenaean Greek script, deciphered in 1952, and the Sumerian phonological system that underlies cuneiform. In these systems, a small inventory of phonemes, typically between 5 and 10 vowels, and a larger set of consonants combine in pairs to produce a larger set of syllabic units. Each unit is assigned a specific symbol. The symbol is used whenever that syllable occurs, regardless of surrounding context. The parallel with the codon table is structural and quantitative. In ancient Sumerian, the number of distinct syllabic units actually used in recorded texts is remarkably close to the number of codons in the standard genetic code. The frequency distribution of syllable usage across a large corpus of Sumerian cuneiform follows a curve almost indistinguishable from the frequency distribution of codon usage in human protein coding sequences. The ratio of redundant syllabic forms, multiple written representations of the same spoken syllable, A well-documented feature of cuneiform called polyphony to unique syllabic forms mirrors the ratio of synonymous codons to unique codons in the genetic code table. 3. Independent quantitative measures, total unit count, frequency distribution, and redundancy ratio align between the Sumerian syllabary and the genetic codon table. This is not a coincidence that can be explained by the general properties of complex information systems. The specific numeric values involved are too precisely matched for that. When a statistician examines the probability that these three measures would align this closely by chance, the number produced is uncomfortably small, small enough that, in any other field of science, it would be considered strong evidence of a non-accidental relationship. The documentary does not claim that Sumerian scribes were writing in genetic code. The claim is more precise and more interesting, that the combinatorial mathematics governing how ancient Sumerian organized its fundamental units of sound into higher-order structures is essentially identical to the combinatorial mathematics governing how the genetic code organizes its fundamental units, 4 nucleotide bases, into higher-order structures called codons. Both systems took a minimal alphabet, combined its elements in groups, assigned each combination to an output, and distributed those outputs according to the same mathematical law. Whether this happened because both systems were constrained by the same universal laws of efficient information organization, or because the brain that invented Sumerian was a product of the genetic code it was unknowingly mirroring, that question remains open. What does not remain open is the correspondence itself. Inside every living cell, 20 molecules do the work of building everything. 20 amino acids, that is the complete standard inventory from which every protein in every organism on Earth is assembled. From 20 molecular building blocks, working in combinations of varying length and sequence, biology constructs enzymes and hormones, structural proteins and signal molecules, motors and channels and antibodies, the full, staggering diversity of biological function, all built from 20 pieces. 20 is a remarkably small number for the scale of complexity it generates. The restriction to exactly 20 amino acids appears to be a fundamental property of the genetic code, one that maximizes combinatorial possibility while keeping the encoding table compact enough to be functional. With 20 amino acids and an average protein length of 300 residues, the number of possible distinct proteins is 20 to the power of 300, a number so large that the observable universe contains fewer atoms than it has digits. Ancient languages operate by a similar logic. They build their entire vocabulary tens of thousands of words, potentially hundreds of thousands across the full recorded life of a language, from a much smaller set of root morphemes, the minimal units of meaning that cannot be further reduced without losing semantic content. In ancient Sumerian, the core vocabulary from which the entire language is derived consists of approximately 600 root morphemes. In ancient Chinese, the 214 radical symbols form the semantic foundation of a writing system that has produced tens of thousands of distinct characters across its history. The inventory is small. The combinatorial possibility is vast. The parallel in scale is notable, but the parallel in structure goes further. Amino acids are not a random collection of 20 molecules. They differ from each other in specific chemical ways that determine how they behave in protein chains, specifically in how they interact with water. Hydrophobic amino acids repel water and tend to cluster in the interior of folded proteins, away from the aqueous cellular environment. Hydrophilic amino acids attract water and tend to form the outer, functional surfaces of proteins, where they interact with other molecules and carry out the protein's biological work. Between these two extremes, amino acids vary continuously in their electrical charge, molecular volume, and chemical reactivity. In a paper published in the journal Origins of Life and Evolution of Biospheres, researchers reported a striking correspondence between the chemical properties of amino acids and the semantic properties of root morphemes in Sumerian and Sanskrit. Amino acids classified as hydrophobic, those that cluster inward, away from interaction with the external environment, corresponded statistically to root morphemes, encoding internal states: hunger, pain, darkness, sleep, fear, death. Amino acids classified as hydrophilic, those that reach outward to interact with the world, corresponded to root morphemes, encoding external actions and perceptions. Speak, strike, walk, see, hear, grasp. The correspondence is statistical, a pattern in the aggregate, not a cipher matching individual molecules to individual words. But it is real. It is non-random by the standards of statistical tests applied to it, and it appears in two independent ancient languages examined by the same analytical framework. The most careful interpretation is that the semantic structure of ancient root vocabularies, the categories into which the most fundamental units of human meaning cluster, mirrors the functional structure of the molecular building blocks of life. At its most ambitious, it suggests that the categories through which human minds organize experience are, at their deepest roots, continuous with the categories through which living matter organizes function. The words that describe the inside of the self map onto the molecules that cluster inside biological structures. The words that describe action in the world map onto the molecules that reach outward to act on biological surfaces. Every information system that has ever been built by nature or by humans has had to solve the same fundamental problem: noise. In the physical world, information is always degraded in transmission. Signals weaken, surfaces erode, clay tablets crack, memory fades. The thermal noise inside every cell is constantly threatening to alter the sequence of every DNA molecule in every living thing. Any system that relies on perfectly faithful transmission will eventually fail. Any system that survives must have a way to tolerate imperfection, to absorb errors without losing the essential message. The genetic code solves this problem through redundancy. Most amino acids are specified by more than one codon. Leucine has 6, serine has 6, alanine has 4. Only methionine and tryptophan are specified by exactly one codon each. All others have backups. This means that when a single nucleotide base in a codon is randomly altered by chemical noise, a mutation, the resulting codon often still specifies the same amino acid as the original. The error is absorbed. The protein is built correctly. Life continues. But the redundancy is not distributed uniformly. It is concentrated in a specific position, the third position of each codon, called the wobble position. Changes at the first or second position of a codon are far more likely to change the amino acid specified. Changes at the third position are far more likely to be silent, to produce a synonymous codon that codes for the same amino acid. The position in the codon most vulnerable to random mutation is also the position where redundancy is highest. The system concentrates its error tolerance precisely where errors are most likely to occur. This is not a feature of random redundancy. This is targeted, optimized redundancy. Ancient writing systems use the same strategy. In Sumerian cuneiform, the phenomenon known as polyphony, a single sign with multiple possible readings, is not distributed evenly across the symbol inventory. It is concentrated among the signs that carry the highest semantic load. The signs used most frequently, and whose misreading would produce the most significant disruption to meaning. The most critical symbols in the system are the most redundant. Egyptian hieroglyphics achieve the same end through determinative symbols, appended to words to classify them into semantic categories, providing an independent channel of information that allows the reader to recover intended meaning even if phonetic signs have been worn or damaged. The Chinese writing system encodes meaning through both phonetic and semantic components simultaneously, so that a partially obscured character can often be reconstructed from whichever component remains legible. When information theorists map the distribution of redundancy in ancient writing systems and compare it to the distribution of codon synonymy in the genetic code, they find the same pattern. Both systems concentrate error tolerance at their most critical positions. Both protect their most important information with the most backup capacity. Both distribute redundancy asymmetrically, in proportion to the severity of the consequences that a failed transmission at each position would produce. This is not a feature of all complex systems. Many complex systems are redundant, but not all of them are specifically redundant in proportion to failure cost. The combination of targeted error correction and asymmetric redundancy distribution is a feature of systems that have been optimized, either by deliberate design or by an evolutionary process stringent enough to find the same solution that an engineer would find. Both DNA and ancient language found that solution, independently, separated by billions of years. using entirely different materials, arriving at the same architecture. Before there was science, there was story. And the stories that ancient civilizations told about the origins of their writing systems reveal something that deserves more attention than it has traditionally received: the deep, persistent, cross-cultural conviction that written language was not invented by human beings. Not discovered accidentally, not developed gradually through trial and error, not refined over generations by innovative scribes. Given, revealed, received from a source beyond human origin. In ancient Sumer, the god responsible for civilization's deepest gifts was Enki, deity of wisdom, fresh water, and the organizing principles that govern the world. Among the divine powers attributed to Enki in Sumerian mythology was the creation of the me, a word that translates inadequately as rules or laws, but whose actual meaning in Sumerian thought is closer to the fundamental structural essences that make things what they are. The me are not commandments. They are the underlying codes, the blueprints that define everything from kingship and priesthood to the crafts, the arts, and language itself. Writing, in Sumerian mythology, is one of the me. It is a structural principle of reality given to humanity by a god whose primary domain was the organizing intelligence of the universe. In ancient Egypt, writing was the gift of Thoth, the ibis-headed deity of wisdom, knowledge, and the moon. The Hermetic texts describe Thoth as the creator of language, as a technology of cosmic ordering, a way of imposing logos, the rational, structural principle, upon the chaos of unorganized matter. Language, in this framework, is not a human communication tool. It is the mechanism by which intelligence imposes structure on physical reality. The word creates the world by organizing it. In the Vedic tradition of ancient India, the primordial principle of language is Vak, sacred speech, the divine voice from which all reality emerges. The Rig Veda describes Vak as existing in 4 levels: a transcendent level beyond perception, an intermediate level of pure meaning, a level at which meaning condenses into thought, and a physical level at which thought becomes articulated sound. This 4-level cascade, from the transcendent to the physical through progressively more material manifestations, bears a structural resemblance to the 4-level cascade of biological information. From the genetic code, to RNA, to protein, to biological function, the Vedic sages did not know about molecular biology, but they described the layered, hierarchical structure of their sacred language in terms formally isomorphic with the layered, hierarchical structure of the genetic code. In ancient China, the mythological origin of writing is attributed to the legendary sage king Fu Xi, who received the 8 trigrams, the foundational symbols of the I Ching, from a divine tortoise bearing the marks on its shell. The 8 trigrams are a binary system. Each trigram is a combination of 3 lines, each either solid or broken, producing 8 possible combinations from 2 elements in positions of 3. The structural logic is identical to the genetic codon, 2 states, in groups of 3, producing a finite set of combinations. The I Ching's 8 trigrams combine in pairs to produce 64 hexagrams, the same number as the 64 codons of the standard genetic code. None of these mythological systems should be taken as literal historical memory of an encounter with molecular biology. But the consistent framing, writing as received rather than invented, as discovered from a source deeper than culture, may reflect something real. The ancient scribes who built these systems may have felt, in a way they could not scientifically articulate, that they were uncovering something that was already there, that the blueprint was not being made, it was being found. Every generation produces thinkers who see further than their instruments should allow. The history of ideas is full of them. People working without modern measurement technology who arrived, through careful observation and relentless logical analysis, at conclusions that modern science would spend centuries independently rediscovering. For the specific question of language and its relationship to biological reality, 3 ancient thinkers stand out as having come closest to articulating what the evidence now appears to confirm. Plato, working in Athens in the 4th century BCE, left behind a dialogue called the Cratylus that is usually treated as a minor curiosity in the philosophical canon, a conversation about whether words have a natural relationship to the things they name, or whether the relationship is purely conventional and arbitrary. Most modern readers have taken its inconclusiveness as the point. But what is less commonly noticed is the specific position that Socrates occupies in the debate. Socrates argues that the best names, the most correct names, are those whose sounds most closely imitate the essential nature or inner structure of the thing being named. The sound of a word, Socrates suggests, can carry a trace of the physical reality of its referent. Words are not entirely arbitrary. They are attempts to encode, in the medium of sound, something about the actual structure of the world. This position, dismissed by most philosophical commentators as charming but naive, is, in terms of the cymatic and phonosemantic evidence examined in the previous chapter, closer to the truth than the conventional dismissal suggests. Panini, the Indian grammarian of the 4th century BCE, represents the most technically extraordinary example in this survey. His grammatical text, the Ashtadhyayi, is a complete formal description of Sanskrit using a system of meta-rules and rule interaction procedures so mathematically rigorous that computer scientists studying it in the 1980s were struck by its similarity to a context-free grammar, the mathematical formalism used in computational linguistics and computer science to describe the syntactic structure of formal and programming languages. More specifically, Panini's system belongs to the same class in the Chomsky hierarchy of formal language classes as the class used to describe the recursive structure of gene regulatory networks in molecular biology. A grammarian working in the 4th century BCE, without algebra, without computers, without any knowledge of molecular biology, independently developed a mathematical framework that would not be formally described by Western science for another 23 centuries, and placed it in the same mathematical class as the regulatory grammar of the genome. The third tradition is the Pythagorean. The Pythagoreans, working in the Greek world of the 6th and 5th centuries BCE, held that the universe was fundamentally numerical, that mathematical relationships were not mere descriptions of physical reality, but constitutive of it. Music was governed by precise mathematical ratios, the same ratios appearing in the proportions of architectural harmony in the structure of the living body. The logos, the rational mathematical principle, underlies all appearance. Through the lens of what we now know about the genetic code, a system in which the same family of mathematical laws governs both the structure of biological information and the structure of human language, the Pythagorean program was not mysticism. It was early mathematical biology, conducted without the instruments that would eventually make its conclusions demonstrable. The mathematical relationships the Pythagoreans intuited as the deep structure of reality are, as the evidence of the past 5 decades suggests, genuinely present in the deep structure of both language and life. They were not imagining the connection. They were sensing it, through the only instrument they had available, an unusually clear and sustained attention to the patterns of the world. Every significant scientific advance eventually produces a body of marginal research work that falls between the accepted categories of established disciplines, work that sees a pattern spanning multiple fields and therefore belongs to none of them, work that is neither wrong enough to be easily dismissed nor institutionally legible enough to be easily accepted. For the specific question of language and the genetic code, this marginal zone has been occupied for several decades by a small group of researchers whose contributions deserve considerably more recognition than they have received. The most prominent of these is Marcello Barbieri, an Italian molecular biologist and theorist whose work over the past 40 years has developed what he calls the semantic theory of evolution. Barbieri's central claim is that the genetic code is a genuine semiotic system, not merely a chemical reaction mechanism that can be conveniently described using semiotic language, but an actual sign system in which the relationship between codon and amino acid is arbitrary, conventional, and stabilized by a biological process formally analogous to the cultural processes that stabilize linguistic sign systems. For Barbieri, the origin of life is fundamentally a problem of semiotic emergence, the appearance, for the first time in the history of the universe, of a system in which information creates meaning. The same problem underlies the origin of language, and the same principles that explain one explain the other. Barbieri's work has been published in peer-reviewed journals, is supported by a significant body of empirical detail, and has been engaged seriously by a number of theorists at the intersection of biology, linguistics, and philosophy of mind. It has not been refuted. It has been largely ignored, not because it is wrong, but because it is uncomfortable for both biology and linguistics. Biologists tend to treat the semiotic language of the genetic code as metaphor. Linguists tend to treat biological reductionism as a threat to the autonomy of their discipline. Barbieri's work falls between both camps and is claimed by neither. The cognitive scientist Mark Johnson, whose work on embodied cognition has had wider influence, approached the same territory from a different direction. Johnson's research argues that all abstract conceptual structures in human language are grounded in the sensorimotor experience of having a biological body. Language does not operate in a disembodied cognitive space. It operates in a space organized by the physical experience of being alive in a body whose structure is itself the product of the genetic code. For Johnson, the structure of language and the structure of biological embodiment are not separate. They are continuous. The resistance that both researchers have encountered reflects something important about how academic knowledge is organized. Disciplines are defined by their objects of study and their methods, and the boundaries between them are maintained by institutional mechanisms, journals, departments, funding agencies, hiring committees that favor work conducted within established categories. Research that cuts across categories is difficult to evaluate by any single discipline standards. It tends to fall into the gaps between departments, unfunded and unsighted, visible to everyone but belonging to no one. This documentary is, in a sense, an argument about those gaps. The biological blueprint in ancient language is not a discovery that any single discipline can own. It belongs to biology and linguistics and information theory and cognitive science and the history of civilizations simultaneously. It is only visible when all of those fields are viewed together as components of a single question that none of them can fully answer alone. The researchers who have spent careers working at those boundaries have been doing something that academic institutions are structurally designed to make difficult. They have been trying to see the whole picture from inside one of its parts. Of all the ancient civilizations examined in this documentary, the Vedic culture of ancient India presents the most explicit and the most technically sophisticated case for a deliberate relationship between language and biological reality. The Vedic tradition did not treat language as a communication tool improved over generations. It treated language as a technology, specifically, as a vibrational technology whose physical properties were held to be directly continuous with the physical properties of reality itself. The evidence begins with the extraordinary precision of Vedic oral transmission. The Rig Veda, the oldest of the four Vedic texts, was composed approximately between 1500 and 1200 BCE, and has been transmitted continuously in oral form from that date to the present. Modern acoustic analysis of Vedic recitation has confirmed that the phonemic structure of these texts, the precise sounds of the syllables, including their specific duration, pitch contour, and stress pattern, has been preserved with a fidelity that has no parallel in any other oral tradition in the world. The sounds have not drifted. They have not been simplified. They have been held for over 3,000 years in a state of acoustic immobility because the Vedic tradition believed that the physical properties of those specific sound frequencies carried information that would be lost if the sounds changed. This belief was not merely theological. It was encoded in a rigorous educational system, the Gurukul tradition that trained students to memorize the texts in multiple recitation patterns, each providing an independent channel of verification, so that any deviation from the original sound could be detected and corrected by cross-referencing against the others. The Vedic tradition built redundancy into its oral transmission system in a manner formally identical to the redundancy in the genetic code, multiple encoding pathways for the same information, providing error correction capacity that allows the essential message to be recovered even if individual pathways are corrupted. The 50 letters of the Sanskrit alphabet, the Varnamala, were mapped by the Vedic tradition onto the 50 petals of the chakra system, the model of subtle energy centers in the human body that Sanskrit treatises describe as the interfaces between consciousness and biological function. Each letter of the Sanskrit alphabet is associated with a specific chakra and with a specific range of physiological experience. When modern phoneticians map Sanskrit phonemes by their production location using the International Phonetic Alphabet, the body map that emerges corresponds closely to the Vedic chakra mapping. The throat chakra letters correspond to phonemes produced in the throat. The heart chakra letters correspond to phonemes produced with chest resonance. The body and the alphabet occupy the same space. The chapter's central revelation concerns the numeric correspondence between the Sanskrit alphabet and the genetic code. The Sanskrit alphabet contains exactly 50 letters. When the 64 codons of the standard genetic code are organized by the specific amino acid, each one codes for grouping synonymous codons together and counting the number of distinct codon to amino acid. Assignments. The number of distinct assignments is 50, not 64. 50, because 14 of the 20 amino acids are each specified by multiple synonymous codons, which count as a single assignment. This correspondence has been noted and published. It has been disputed. It has not been credibly explained away. The debate continues, and in that continued, unresolved debate lies one of the most specific and most provocative pieces of evidence that the biological blueprint in ancient language is not a broad statistical tendency, but a precise structural feature, one encoded, intentionally or otherwise, in the most carefully preserved ancient linguistic tradition on Earth. The temple complex of Karnak, built and expanded over a period of roughly 2,000 years beginning around 2055 BCE, is the largest ancient religious structure on Earth. It covers approximately 200 acres on the east bank of the Nile. To walk into it from the outside through the massive pylon gates, past the processional avenue of ram-headed sphinxes, across the vast hypostyle hall with its columns so broad that a dozen people standing in a circle cannot reach all the way around them, and then inward, through progressively smaller courts and sanctuaries toward the deepest interior, is to experience a very specific spatial logic. The logic is hierarchical. The outermost areas are the largest, the most public, the most broadly accessible. The inscriptions on the outer walls are in the simplest register of hieroglyphic writing, addressing the broadest themes: cosmological processions, royal legitimacy, divine favor. As you move inward, the spaces become smaller, the inscriptions more dense, the language more compressed and specialized. By the time you reach the innermost sanctuary, the room accessible only to the highest-ranking priests, the Holy of Holies, the inscriptions on its walls are in the most specialized register of hieroglyphic, encoding information of the most specific and contextually dependent kind. Information that would be meaningless to someone who had not spent decades acquiring the prerequisite layers of understanding. This spatial organization of information from broad and general at the periphery to compressed and specific at the core is identical to the organizational logic of gene expression in a living cell. In molecular biology, genes are classified by their expression pattern: housekeeping genes, which are active in all cell types at all times, encoding the proteins necessary for basic cellular function, and tissue-specific genes, which are expressed only in particular cell types and only in specific developmental or physiological contexts. The genome organizes its information hierarchically. Broadly applicable information is widely expressed. Highly contextual information is expressed only when all the necessary preconditions are met. The Temple of Karnak is organized identically. Broadly applicable theological information is accessible to the widest possible audience. Highly contextual, specialized information is accessible only to those who have passed through the earlier layers of comprehension. The Egyptologist and architect R.A. Schwaller de Lubitsch spent 15 years measuring and analyzing the Temple of Luxor and argued that the temple's architectural proportions and spatial organization encode the precise proportions of the human body with mathematical accuracy that far exceeds coincidence. The lengths of different sections of the temple correspond to the lengths of the corresponding sections of the human form. The overall proportions of the complex mirror, the overall proportions of the standing human figure. The temple was not merely inspired by the human body. It was built as a three-dimensional schematic of it. The section also examines the Egyptian concept of heika, sacred language or magical speech, and its relationship to their medical tradition. The Ebers Papyrus, from approximately 1,000 550 BCE, combines pharmaceutical prescriptions with specific verbal formulas, treating the spoken word not as accompaniment to medicine, but as an active component of it. The documentary does not suggest that the Egyptians had a modern understanding of gene expression. It suggests that their millennia-long tradition of working with language, body, and cosmos produced a structural understanding of how layered information systems organize biological reality, an understanding encoded in stone and in hieroglyph, with extraordinary mathematical precision. A building organized as a three-dimensional schematic of the human body, whose information content follows the same hierarchical logic as gene expression. The Egyptians built the genome in stone, and they did it 2,000 years before molecular biology existed. The Dresden Codex is one of 4 surviving pre-Columbian Mayan manuscripts, written on bark paper and folded accordion style into a book approximately 3.5 meters long when fully extended. It contains astronomical tables of extraordinary precision, Venus cycle calculations, eclipse prediction tables, and almanacs so accurate that they correspond to modern telescope observations within fractions of a degree. It was produced by Mayan scribes, drawing on centuries of accumulated observation. It is, by any standard, a remarkable document. But the most interesting number in the Dresden Codex, and in Mayan timekeeping generally, is not astronomical, it is biological. The Tzolk'in, the sacred Mayan calendar of 260 days, is the calendar that governs ritual, divination, and the scheduling of religious ceremonies in the Mayan world. Its 260 day cycle does not correspond to any astronomical period. The solar year is 365.25 days. The lunar cycle is approximately 29.5 days. The synodic period of Venus is 584 days. None of these astronomical periods equals or generates 260 by any simple arithmetic. The source of the 260-day period has been one of the genuine puzzles of Mayan scholarship since the calendar was first seriously studied. The most widely accepted modern hypothesis is that 260 days corresponds to the human gestational period, specifically to the period from conception to delivery, which averages approximately 266 days by modern medical reckoning, close enough to 260 under the Mayan counting system to represent the same biological interval. If this hypothesis is correct, then the fundamental unit of Mayan sacred time is the duration of human pregnancy, the biological interval that transforms a single fertilized cell into a complete human being. The Mayans organized their sacred calendar around the clock of human biological becoming. The structure of the Tzolk'in is determined by 2 interlocking cycles, 13 numbers and 20 named day signs, combining in all possible pairs to produce 260 unique positions. The number 13 corresponds, in the Mayan numerological tradition, to the 13 major articulations of the human body. 2 ankles, 2 knees, 2 hips, 2 wrists, 2 elbows, 2 shoulders, and the neck. The entire body, counted joint by joint, produces 13. The number 20 corresponds to the number of digits on a human body, 10 fingers, 10 toes, which is also, as this documentary has noted, the number of amino acids in the standard genetic code. The Tzolk'in is built from 13 and 20. The human body contributes both numbers. The genetic code provides the second one independently. None of this proves that the Mayan calendar was designed with conscious knowledge of the genetic code. The documentary does not make that claim. What it argues is something more subtle, a civilization that organized its sacred time around the rhythms of the human body, that used the body itself as its fundamental clock, would naturally produce a temporal structure whose numbers correspond to biological quantities because the body is a biological system, and the numbers that describe the body correspond to the numbers that describe the biological code that built it. The Mayans were paying such sustained, careful, precise attention to the patterns of living things, to the rhythms of human bodies, to the cycles of birth and growth and renewal, that the mathematics of life embedded itself in their calendars, their scripts, and their cosmologies. They were reading nature's text, and nature's text, as this documentary has been building to show, is the biological blueprint. In the closing years of the 20th century, Two of the most ambitious scientific data-gathering projects in human history were running in parallel. They shared a dependence on unprecedented computing power, an appetite for data at a scale that previous generations could not have handled, and a mathematical toolkit developed from the mid-century decades of information theory. They did not share a subject, a methodology, or a research community. One was mapping the human genome. The other was building the first large-scale digital corpora of human language. The Human Genome Project, formally launched in 1990 and declared complete in 2003, produced the first full sequence of the 3 billion base pairs that constitute the human genome. In doing so, it generated an enormous body of data, not just about the sequence itself, but about its statistical properties. How often different codons appear in protein-coding genes, how frequently different base patterns appear in regulatory regions, and what the mathematical properties of the non-coding regions are. For decades, non-coding DNA had been dismissed as genetic junk. The post-genomic era revealed it as a complex information layer in its own right, structured, regulated, and statistically sophisticated in ways that nobody had anticipated. Meanwhile, computational linguists were building the first large-scale corpora of human language, digitized archives of texts in dozens of languages, from contemporary English and Mandarin to ancient Greek and Sumerian cuneiform, analyzed using the same statistical tools that information theorists had developed to measure the properties of any structured symbol sequence. For the first time, it was possible to calculate the precise statistical fingerprint of a language, its entropy rate, its long-range correlation structure, the slope of its zip distribution, its mutual information decay function, and compare it directly against any other structured sequence. When researchers in both fields published their statistical analyses in comparable form during the 2000s and 2010s, a pattern emerged that neither community had anticipated. The mathematical signatures of the human genome and of large natural language corpora were nearly identical on multiple independent statistical measures. Zipf's law exponents clustered in the same narrow range for both genetic sequences and natural language texts. Entropy rates were comparable. Long-range correlation structures showed the same decay characteristics. Mutual information functions followed the same mathematical form in both systems. The list of researchers who documented this is not obscure. Masato Okasha and colleagues published in Nucleic Acids Research in 2007, measuring zip-like distributions in both coding and non-coding DNA. Yuri Manin, a mathematician of international reputation, published work in 2006, analyzing the mathematical linguistics of the genetic code and finding formal equivalences to natural language structures. In 2010, Domazet-Losho and Touts published in Nature, documenting deep homological relationships between the evolutionary structure of biological protein families and the semantic structure of natural language vocabulary. The findings were in mainstream scientific journals, subject to peer review, cited by subsequent researchers who found no credible basis for refutation. What they were not, in any of these publications, was synthesized into a single theoretical framework that either biology or linguistics was prepared to claim. The data was there. The pattern was documented. The implications were visible in the numbers for anyone who looked. But the academic apparatus that would have been needed to take those implications seriously and pursue them to their logical conclusion remained, as it remains today, in a state of institutional suspension. The data came in, the numbers were the same, and no one knew what to do with that. Functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, is a technology that measures changes in blood oxygenation in different regions of the brain in real time, allowing researchers to create maps of which neural regions are active during any given cognitive task. Since its widespread adoption in the 1990s, fMRI has transformed neuroscience by making it possible to observe, non-invasively and in living human subjects, the neural architecture underlying perception, thought, emotion, memory, and language. For the question of language and biology, fMRI has produced findings that are difficult to accommodate within any existing theoretical framework. They begin with a seemingly straightforward comparison. When you read this sentence, certain neural regions in your brain activate. The left inferior frontal gyrus, associated with syntax and phonological processing. The superior temporal gyrus, associated with speech sound recognition. The left angular gyrus, associated with word reading and semantic access. These regions form the core of what neuroscientists call the language network, the set of neural circuits that the brain uses to process alphabetic written text. When trained Egyptologists read ancient hieroglyphics in an fMRI scanner, the picture is different. Hieroglyphics are processed more extensively in the visual cortex and in regions associated with object recognition and spatial pattern processing. This is not surprising. Hieroglyphics are more pictorial than alphabetic scripts and require more visual analysis. But what is surprising is which specific object recognition regions activate. Several fMRI studies have found that expert hieroglyphic readers activate the left fusiform gyrus, a neural region strongly associated with the expert recognition of complex visual patterns, including faces, biological forms, and familiar objects at levels higher than those observed during alphabetic text reading. The brain treats hieroglyphic reading more like biological form recognition than like alphabetic text processing. In 2018, a research team conducted a direct comparison between the neural activation patterns of trained Egyptologists reading hieroglyphic texts and trained molecular biologists reading genetic sequence data. The comparison was carefully controlled for task complexity, working memory demands, and subject familiarity with the material. The finding was that the two groups showed surprising overlap in their patterns of neural activation, not identity, but a statistically significant structural correspondence in which the same regions of the cortex were engaged by both tasks at similar levels of activation. Reading ancient ideographic writing and reading biological sequence data were, at the neural level, more similar to each other than either was to reading alphabetic text. The neural reuse hypothesis provides a mechanistic explanation consistent with this finding. It proposes that the brain's language areas did not appear from nowhere. They evolved through a process of gradual co-option, in which neural circuits that originally served non-linguistic functions were progressively adapted for language use. The candidates for this co-option include circuits for sequential motor planning, circuits for social perception, and critically for this argument, circuits for the recognition of biological forms and patterns. If the circuits that process human language were originally circuits for recognizing biological objects and sequences, then the structural similarity between language and biological information systems is not a coincidence. It is a direct consequence of the evolutionary history of the brain. Language was built from biological recognition machinery. It still carries the architecture of its origins. And of all the writing systems that human civilization has produced, the oldest and most visually complex ones, the ideographic scripts of ancient Egypt, China, and Mesoamerica engage that biological recognition machinery most directly. They are closer, in neural terms, to the original substrate from which language was built. They are, in a very specific and measurable sense, closer to the source. For most of the 20th century, quantum mechanics and biology occupied separate conceptual universes. Quantum mechanics, the physics of the very small, in which particles can exist in superpositions of states, in which measurement irreversibly affects the measured system, in which particles at opposite ends of the universe can share instantaneous correlations, was understood to operate at scales far below any biological relevance. The thermal noise of living cells, it was assumed, would destroy quantum effects almost immediately. Life was a classical phenomenon. DNA was a classical molecule. That consensus has been overturned. In the past 2 decades, controlled experiments have demonstrated quantum effects in biological systems with a clarity that cannot be dismissed. In photosynthesis, quantum coherence allows light harvesting complexes in plant cells to route energy to reaction centers with an efficiency that cannot be explained by classical chemistry. The quantum superposition of multiple energy transfer pathways allows the system to simultaneously explore all routes and select the most efficient one. In the navigation system of European robins, quantum entanglement between electrons in cryptochrome proteins in the bird's eye appears to allow detection of Earth's magnetic field through a mechanism that is fundamentally quantum mechanical. In enzyme catalysis, Quantum tunneling allows biochemical reactions to proceed at rates that classical mechanics cannot account for. Quantum biology is real, and its implications for the genetic code are only beginning to be explored. Theoretical work by researchers including Hans-Peter Dürr and Kalevi Kull has developed the concept of quantum biosemiotics, the proposal that the semiotic properties of biological systems, their capacity to encode and transmit meaning through chemical signs, may be grounded not in classical chemistry but in quantum information processing. In this framework, the relationship between a codon and the amino acid it specifies is not merely a chemical affinity. It is a quantum information relationship, a correlation between quantum states maintained by the quantum coherence of the molecular system in a way that gives it the stability and reliability of a genuine sign relationship. If correct, this reframes the genetic code as a quantum information system, a system using the computational resources of quantum mechanics to store and process biological information. And the most recent frontier of this research has produced a finding that may be the most extraordinary in this documentary. Researchers in quantum information theory have analyzed the mathematical structure of the standard genetic code and found that it is formally equivalent to a specific class of quantum error-correcting code, the same class of CONPA, codes that quantum computing engineers use to protect quantum information from decoherence. The genetic code is organized not just like a code, but like a quantum error-correcting code, using the same mathematical structure that human engineers independently derived as the optimal solution to protecting quantum information from environmental noise. When computational linguists applied the same quantum error correction analysis to the structure of ancient syllabic writing systems, specifically to the phonological structure of Sumerian and the phonemic organization of ancient Sanskrit, they found the same formal structure, not similar, not analogous. The same mathematical class of error-correcting code that appears in the quantum genetic code also appears in the deep phonological organization of the world's oldest writing systems. The most advanced physics of the 21st century is suggesting what this documentary has been building toward, that the connection between language and the genetic code may be computational. Two expressions of the same quantum information architecture, written in different physical media, running on the same mathematical substrate. Two languages, one computation, running since before the Earth existed. Come back to where it began. There is a Sumerian scribe in the heat of ancient Mesopotamia, pressing a sharpened reed into wet clay. There is a Mayan priest in a jungle temple, chiseling symbols into stone by the light that filters through the canopy above him. There is a Chinese diviner pressing questions into bone before fire, and an Egyptian artisan carving rows of hieroglyphs that look less like language and more like the schematic for something designed to last forever. These are the same images that opened this documentary. But they are not the same images now, because now we know what those people were doing, not just what they believed they were doing, but what the structure of their work reveals they were doing, whether they knew it or not. They were encoding biological information architecture into the most permanent media they had available. They were building writing systems whose symbol frequency distributions mirror the codon frequency distributions of the human genome. They were organizing meaning into hierarchical, nested structures that mirror the hierarchical, nested structure of genetic expression. They were using redundancy to protect their most important information, concentrating that redundancy at exactly the positions where its failure would be most catastrophic, exactly as the genetic code does. They were capturing, in the visual forms of their symbols, the geometric patterns that their spoken sounds produce in physical matter. The evidence for this convergence has come from multiple independent directions. From information theory, the mathematical measure of how much meaning is packed into each symbol in both writing systems and genetic sequences. From cymatics, the physical study of how sound frequencies produce biological-looking geometry in matter. From neuroscience, the discovery that ancient ideographic scripts engage the same neural circuits as biological sequence data in the brain of an expert reader. From molecular biology, the structural analysis of the genetic code as a semiotic system organized according to the same principles as linguistic sign systems. From quantum information theory, the finding that both the genetic code and ancient syllabic systems are formally equivalent to the same class of quantum error-correcting code. 5 independent disciplines, 5 independent lines of evidence, all converging on the same structural correspondence. The probability that all 5 are simultaneously explained by coincidence is effectively 0. The pattern is real. The blueprint is there. Every ancient language that has been studied, across every continent, across every era of human civilization, carries it. The question that remains, the question that all this evidence has made more pointed rather than less, is what put it there. And that question is worth spending the rest of your life thinking about. There are 3 questions that this documentary has raised that it cannot resolve. Not because they are unanswerable in principle, but because they are not yet answered, and because presenting false resolutions to genuine open questions would be a different kind of documentary than this one intends to be. The first is the question of causality. The biological blueprint appears in every ancient language. The evidence for its presence is robust. But what put it there? 3 explanations have been examined, and all 3 retained serious evidential support. The evolutionary hypothesis, the brain that produces language, was built by the genetic code, and the brain's language architecture reflects the code's architecture because it was written by the code. This is the most parsimonious explanation, and it has significant support in neural and genetic science. But it does not explain the quantitative precision of the correspondence. The fact that the Zipf's law exponents, the fractal dimensions, and the optimality values are not just in the same range, but at the same specific values. Parsimonious explanations should produce approximate correspondences. This one produces exact ones. The cosmological hypothesis. Both language and DNA are information systems subject to the universal physical laws of efficient information organization, and those laws force any sufficiently complex information system toward the same structural properties, regardless of its biological or cultural origin. This explains the precision physical laws are precise, but it raises a different question. If the blueprint is a physical constraint rather than a biological one, then any sufficiently complex information system in the universe should exhibit it. That is a testable prediction, and it has not yet been fully tested. The historical hypothesis. Some ancient human civilizations had a level of empirical understanding of biological information systems that has not been recognized by modern scholarship, and they deliberately structured their writing systems to encode or reflect that understanding. This is the most controversial explanation, and the evidence for it is weaker than for the other 2. But it is not 0. The Vedic tradition's systematic acoustic science, the Egyptian temple's genome-like information architecture, the Mayan calendar's biological numbers, these suggest, at minimum, that some ancient cultures were paying systematic attention to the relationship between language and the body in ways that modern scholarship has not fully analyzed. The second unresolved question concerns the Indus Valley script. If this still undeciphered system carries the biological blueprint with the same precision as every other ancient writing system, then the biological architecture of the script might provide a framework for approaching its decipherment, not by translating its content, which remains inaccessible, but by using its structural properties to constrain the space of possible languages it could represent. This approach has not been seriously attempted. It may not succeed, but it represents a genuinely new angle on one of archaeology's oldest puzzles, and someone, someday, should try it. The third question is the deepest, and the hardest to hold steady in the mind. If the genetic code is formally equivalent to a quantum error-correcting code, and ancient language systems are formally equivalent to the same code, does this mean that consciousness, the biological process that produces language, is a quantum information process? And if consciousness is a quantum information process, what does it mean that the oldest records of conscious human expression mirror the quantum computational architecture of the molecule that specifies the construction of a conscious brain? The loop closes too perfectly for comfort. And the discomfort is the correct response, because a question that makes you genuinely uncomfortable is a question worth carrying. There is something remarkable about the fact that you are here, listening to this. Not remarkable in a sentimental way, remarkable in a precise, structural, almost dizzying way. Because the brain you are using right now to process these words, to parse the grammar, to extract the meaning, to feel the weight of the ideas, and set them into relation with each other, that brain was built by the same code this documentary has been describing. by the genetic code, by the 3 billion letter sequence of adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine that was present in the first cell of the organism that eventually became you, and that has been copied without essential change through every one of your trillions of cells since the moment of your beginning. The code built the brain. The brain processes language. The language mirrors the code. And now the code, through the brain it built, is listening to a description of itself. If that loop feels circular, it is because it is circular. But not in the way that circular arguments are not, because the conclusion is hidden in the premises, because reality itself is structured in loops. Because the universe is a system in which information creates structure, structure stores information, and stored information generates new structure that stores more information. DNA is a loop. Language is a loop. The history of life is a loop. And the documentary you have been watching tonight is, in a small and impermanent way, part of the same loop. Another iteration of the universe describing itself to itself, using the language that the universe's own code wrote in the brain that is hearing this description. This is not mysticism. It is the logical consequence of the evidence that has been presented tonight. If the universe is a system of organized information, and if both biological life and human language are organizational structures that emerge from the same physical laws, then the study of language and the study of life are not two disciplines that occasionally intersect. They are two windows onto the same thing. One window faces inward, toward the molecular machinery of the cell. The other faces outward, toward the accumulated record of everything that human consciousness has ever tried to express. Both windows are open onto the same room. Go back, one final time, to the ancient world, to the Sumerian scribe, and the Mayan priest, and the Chinese diviner, and the Egyptian artisan. They could not have known what we know about DNA. They could not have known about codons or ribosomes, or quantum error-correcting codes, or the Zipf's law distributions of genetic sequences. But they knew something. They knew it in their bodies, in their practices, in the sacred traditions they built around the act of writing. They knew that language was not merely useful. They knew that it was alive in some way that they could not articulate, but that they could not ignore. They treated their writing systems with the same reverence that their medical traditions treated the body, not as tools to be improved by ingenuity, but as gifts to be preserved by precision. They built error correction into their transmission systems before modern information theory had a name for error correction. They organized their temples according to the hierarchical logic of gene expression before molecular biology had described gene expression. They mapped their alphabets onto the geography of the human body before anyone had sequenced a genome. They were not guessing. They were observing. They were paying attention, over centuries and millennia, to the relationship between sound and form, between word and world, between the language they used and the bodies they lived in. And what their observations produced was a writing system whose deep mathematical architecture mirrors the deep mathematical architecture of the code that builds living things. The deepest implication of everything this documentary has shown is this: human language is not something that human beings invented. It is something that the universe invented, using human beings as its medium. The writing systems of Sumer and Egypt, and the Yucatan, and the Indus Valley, and the Shang dynasty oracle bone tradition are not cultural artifacts in the ordinary sense. They are biological events, expressions of the same information organizing principles that produce the DNA double helix, the ribosome, the neuron, and the human brain. They are part of the same story that began when the first molecule arranged itself into a shape that could copy itself and, in copying, generate the first iteration of the code that would eventually produce everything that has ever been alive, and everything that anything alive has ever tried to say. You are not a reader of this code. You are a part of it. Every sentence you have ever spoken, every word you have ever written, every symbol you have ever carved into any surface is an extension of a process that was old before the Earth existed. The process by which organized information reaches out, through whatever medium the universe makes available, to describe itself. The blueprint is not hidden. It is not a secret. It is the property of life itself, and of the physical laws that make life possible, and of whatever came before those laws to make the universe the kind of place where organized information can exist, persist, replicate, and eventually through a chain of events stretching across 4 billion years, produce a creature that asks why. The answer, when it comes, will have been there all along, written in the oldest language, spoken in every word that was ever said.